Hey, all, this is a continuation of last week's podcast. We decided instead of just releasing one absolutely mega pod to split them up into two parts. And so this is just a continuation of our conversation last week. So I would highly encourage you to go back and listen to last week's episode if you haven't already. And so we will pick up right where we left off, right after our bumper music. Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. Yeah, I mean, I loved everything you had to say, and I think it just leads naturally to talking about the even maybe messier part of all of this, which is funny because you would think the messiest part of this would be, the situation where Elijah is taking part in this wizard prophet duel sort of situation, right, and then goes on to slaughter 450 people. That would be the messiest part. But then I go, man, is the messiest part in the situation the culpability and the accountability that God has for the people of Israel? Yeah. So again, fantastic. And again, it's one of those funny things about our podcast. You always just end up leaving us. We end up being left in this place of like, it's messy, but that's the way it's supposed to be. It's good. But moving on to the messier, maybe possibly the physically messier part of the whole affair. I am just really I'm not sure what to do with it, and I don't think we can come to a completely compelling answer in terms of what is happening in the story. But you have this prophet duel going on. So you have Elijah taking part in this ritualistic these ritualistic sacrifices, and you have Elijah offering up this ritualistic sacrificial battle of sorts. And there is this weird thing where like, this is what would be expected, right? So like Elijah demands this of Ahab. Ahab goes along with it. You talked a little bit about the power imbalance of it. Is that why Ahab goes along with it so quickly? A part of it is probably like, this is what is expected, right? This is what prophets of different gods in this time would do. Like you have these tests to prove who the real God is. So you have Elijah participating in totally fulfilling the expectations of what a prophet for a ancient Near East God would do. Then in the process, you have Elijah absolutely mocking, while Elijah is carrying out the will of God, mocking these other false prophets. Then you have Elijah, and it doesn't say that God commands him to. It doesn't say that he's compelled to by the Spirit of God. Elijah seemingly takes it on himself to go and put these people to death, and we don't get a moral judgment on if that was good or not. But yet it does seem there's so much complexity to this and messiness of the situation where you get this really awesome thing where Yahweh comes through and Yahweh proves that he is the God to be worshiped, to be respected, to be honored, to be placed on high. And yet in the midst of while Elijah is doing all this, you have all this weird messiness and I don't want to say corruption, but you go like, man, there seems to be like there are some threads here that are not like fully in line with how you would perceive a follower of God to be doing something good, bringing about something good for human flourishing.
I totally agree, and I always go to if you had never read the Bible, and yes, ancient cultures function different than today. So if you were to transport yourself to an era where animal sacrifice is pretty commonplace, and that's true, but still the scene, you wouldn't think, oh, that's probably the one true God that's doing that. You know what I mean? Like all these ingredients, the challenge itself. Like I think it is fascinating how much modern Christianity says precedent matters big time. Precedent matters. We need to do it the way our forefathers did it. We need to set up our worship, our church building, our structure, our all this. And then the Bible is like, what's precedent mean? Because we do it different every time. Like there's not a single battle that's hardly even similar, in the Old Testament. And so the showdown is just weird by, Bible standards. I mean, it's not weird in the sense I don't believe it happened based on the same historical evidence that I believe any other part of the Old Testament happened. I believe this happened. But when we think about if this had never happened and we are like, okay, how do you think God will solve this? You got 450 prophets. I would think, oh, well then, it's like Abraham. He's going to raise up an army of his people. Or it's like David. He's going to raise up an army of his people. And it's like, you wouldn't think, well, what he's going to do is he's not going to raise up an army. And you're like, okay, that's weird. And he's going to do a showdown where they call fire from the sky. Now, this part right here is mind-blowing to me on behalf of the prophets of Baal, because you have two options. Either, number one, they've done it before and it was successful, hence their confidence.
Yeah.
Or they think neither of them will be able to do it, or they like, what's the other option here? Because it's like, if you were like, okay, Jason, I'll believe God if you can go out in my backyard and call down fire and it, just burns up the whole space. I would immediately say, well, hey, that's not mine to give. You know what I mean? That's not mine. I'm like, I don't know if that's within my power set or his power set, and I'm talking about on the side of the prophets of Baal. What are they thinking?
Yeah.
Like, are they just thinking? That's just mind blowing to me.
Yeah. Well, and I think it leads credence, and if you want like a short blow by blow, there's been a lot of Bible Project podcasts and videos done on spiritual beings, drawing a lot on a guy who just passed away, real sad, named Michael Heiser. Like, this would lead a lot of credence for me to believe that that there is a real spiritual power that Yahweh is going. There's a spiritual power that the prophets of Baal had called upon before for something similar like this, and that spiritual power came through, and then there is a actual battle going on with this God between Yahweh, and Yahweh is trouncing him, because, like you said, it wouldn't make sense if they didn't think that this was possible, that they couldn't come through, that this wasn't something that happened, then they would have to, all 450 would have to be just drunk out of their minds or high-key delusional. Otherwise, this story doesn't make any sense at all.
Exactly right. Yeah, and you framed it exactly right. That's exactly what I was thinking is they are committed. I can remember having a discussion with somebody and they're like, man, I really respect, this goes back to 9/11, I really respect the commitment the terrorists showed when they, got into that airplane knowing they were going to die. And I'm like, okay, I'll give you that. It's delusional from my vantage point, and I don't think there's any truth. And, even if there was no loss of life, even if it was just them committing suicide to please their God, I'm like, I don't believe that's true. But I can recognize you're really sold out to this.
Yeah, they believe it.
You're not half-hearted. Yeah, exactly. That's what you see here. These guys believe fully their efforts would lead to fire coming down and setting it on fire, And so this didn't come from nowhere. The other thing that's interesting is we don't have the interaction, which doesn't mean it did not happen, but we don't have the interaction of God pulling Elijah aside. And many times we do with other situations where God pulls Moses aside. He's like, hey, here's exactly what we're going to do, Where did this come from? And I think it's very possible that God pulled him aside and said, hey, here's what I want you to say. It's also very possible that God's like, hey, you know how this goes with these guys. This is exactly what they're going to ask for. And I'm like, don't be afraid of it. Because though we don't know the history of, well, I guess this is not quite fair, but we don't know the history of the prophets of Baal. We do know enough about the history of Elijah versus what's revealed in the scriptures that this has not happened before. So then we're like, where did he get his confidence? Which really sets up what happens next chapter.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's like, because I can talk all day about, hey, here's what God can do. But if you're like, okay, show me one thing, I'm like, I'm talking about even stuff that I've witnessed in my life.
So here's, and again, we can't know this for sure, so I'm not like saying this is what happened. I'm just saying here's a possibility. Had Elijah seen prophets of Baal do this before, and he goes, my God's more powerful than that, I can beat them at their own game that I've seen them already accomplish.
Yes.
Like, I'm not saying but I think that's a reasonable possibility to think as that could be where this comes from.
Yeah, exactly. So then I'm like, and I'm always about how do I apply this in my life? But when you pray fervently for someone to be healed of cancer, I've got several people in my life that have cancer. And so we're praying for them. And then when one calls you and said, hey, I am in remission, it's gone. I mean, They don't know what to think exactly. They're like, that's fantastic. I give God glory for that. Then I have another friend get cancer. Do I immediately say, oh, you're going to be fine?
Yeah.
Because I prayed for this. I've seen it happen before. I think we work the opposite way. I think subconsciously we think it worked for person A. It's probably not going to work for, I don't know of a person that doesn't think if it's going well, the other shoe's going to drop. Yeah. And I think that kind of plays out here. There's no big point I'm making other than this is hard work that Elijah's doing.
Sure. It is. And I also think, I think it's important to remember that when we think about somebody carrying out the will of God, and, you know, whether Elijah was directly told, he infers this is just a general idea that he gets because he's constantly communing with God, whatever it may be. Whatever it may be, as if it wasn't God literally saying exactly, hey, Elijah, do this, and then I will do this. If it's not that, whether it's inclinations or it's, you know, judging, like him just kind of taking a step of faith, God could come through and it still not look exactly like how it ended up looking through. Like, so we have this because it happened in history that this was the only way that God would deliver Elijah and deliver the people from the prophets of Baal, but that it didn't have to look exactly like this. And so again, I think like with your situation, like where you talk about praying for somebody who was just diagnosed with cancer, recognizing that God is going to come through. And sometimes it's going to look exactly like how you planned it out to look and how you foresee it coming out. And then a lot of times it's actually not going to look like that. And maybe there's a story in the timeline of the people of Israel where there was a prophet who tried something similar to this, and then it seemingly didn't work out, seemingly didn't come through. Because honestly, now you think about it, like there were people that loved Yahweh, and yet the prophets of Baal kept on winning. So obviously there were times where people of Yahweh thought, oh, here is the time where Ahab, or here's where the time where the corrupt king comes through and really recognizes who the true God is and who we need to put on high. And obviously that did not happen. It kept on not happening. And yeah, there's a lot there. Do you have anything else to add to that specific part?
So much. Yeah. So no, I think that this is the challenge with this is the challenge we have with all scripture. It's like, what piece transfers? You know, what piece? I don't think God is calling us, hey, next time you see something going wrong, you simply need to go in and say, hey, you guys built your altar, I'll build mine, we'll take off with that. You know, there's Jesus didn't do that. You know, he didn't say, hey, you really want to understand stuff? Let's go back to something you know, and I'm gonna reproduce it. And so because of Jesus' practice of not, you know, he didn't part seas, for example, and he didn't do a lot of the things the Old Testament prophets did, we don't carry forward that idea. In order to be a faithful servant of God, we have to do these things, you know. So what is the transferable piece? And I do think it is that, I think two things. One, and it's so cliched, it can become white noise to us if we're not careful, but it's important that we really trust ourselves and our real lives to God, not generally speaking. But this conversation I'm having right now, I want to entrust it to God. You know, the second piece is God works with what we know. You know, I think there's kind of a sense that if I was really walking with God, I do all this stuff that I don't even know anything about. Like I immediately, you know, magically speak in another language, this kind of thing. And certainly God can use that. But so many times, I would say the majority of times, and I offer you, you know, David and Goliath, you know, why not give David a magic sword and, you know, this kind of thing? He used what he knew. And I think we dramatically undervalue the giftedness we bring into situations because they're common to us. Well, all I do is cut grass, or all I do is, you know, computer programming, or all I do is, and God's like, watch me. I mean, will you entrust this to me? So trust your life, but then say, okay, if God gave me these gifts, these connections, these situations, I'm going to trust that he's using them. Yeah. Now, the timing may be instantaneous, fire from the sky, and the timing may take a dozen years. God seems very unconcerned about speed. You know, when it's his time, whatever he's going to do. And I think that, to me, is the big takeaway is, okay, entrust myself to him and assume, hey, if he gave me these gifts, these opportunities, he's going to use them, even if I don't see it playing out right in front of my eyes.
Yeah, that's so good. We touched a little bit on it before, but I think it's important to just to maybe just touch on it a little bit more. So in verse 39, this is right after God has sent the consuming fire to the sacrifice. It says, when all the people saw this being Yahweh coming through, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. Yahweh is God." Then Elijah commanded them. This is immediately after, so the people recognize, like, choose Yahweh after not choosing him, a few verses before this, they choose him. And then Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let any of them get away." They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. So I think we had brought up the question before, and I think it's just important to know, like, we can't know the answer. But I think it's important when we assume the assumption, I feel like, from most of my Bible reading career or history, or when I've heard people talk about it, is to assume, oh, well, it was a godly person, and so that just must mean that God commanded him to do that. And so either you have the person that goes, oh, that means God is evil, or, oh, that means I need to pretend this verse doesn't exist, and we're going to, we're going to dance around it. But I do think it is an important thing to remind ourselves there are other options in terms of what is going on in this passage, and they all have interesting ramifications. But yeah, I just want to put it out there. What I would have read as a kid, and I think what was passed down to me, would be assume, oh, because it's a prophet and because it's not directly contradicted, that means God is completely okay with what is happening in his name.
Yeah, and I think I always go to David in my mind, where he is killing the Moabites in this really cruel, like they were already submitted to him, and he's killing them, and so many situations that show up, and you're like, well, I think we try to make God's people perfect people. And even when God exposes areas that are really weak, we kind of separate it. Well, but, in general, they're perfect, and it's like, no, it held different weight. We value life differently, apparently, than past eras. But at the end of the day, they're still all made in God's image. They're still, they still have a choice. I'm not suggesting it's this kind of dynamic that I don't know enough about their cultural perspective. But yeah, I mean, I think to be a catalyst in killing 450 people, is that my thinking right? Is that the number there? But to be a catalyst, I mean, I don't see any bearing, which I'm like, I don't see God specifically saying, hey, you need to kill all these people, So could that be a weakness in Elijah? Could it even be why we're going to find him in 18 so shaken? In other words, with the victory, did it kind of go to his head a little bit, and then when he gets hit in the mouth like he does in the next chapter, I guess 19, then he's like, is that why he gets so shaken? He's moved off a little, because I know I've been in those situations where I really felt like, man, the Spirit of God's here. And then I do something later, I'm like, I think it was God, and then it was a little bit of me there.
Yeah, I think when you murdered those 400 people, I was like, Jason, that might not be.
I try to keep it to single digits, that. But anyway, yeah, exactly. But it's that kind of thing. I'm like, oh yeah, I think that's there. And yeah,
I think the really important part to remind ourselves is that, so we don't know exactly what God is doing in this moment, but like even in the height of like being connected with God and really in concert with his will and carrying it out, and seemingly being like, as like a minister and as a former like pastor, being at the forefront of what God is doing in a new thing, the assumption goes, because we were so successful or so in concert with what God is doing in this one area, that the very next thing I'm going to do like is going to come off exactly without a hitch, and I'm going to know exactly what the best thing to do is in the next moment, because the previous moment I was so in concert with what God was up to. And I think, I've seen so many people make this mistake, thankfully not the murdering lots of people or killing or slaughtering or however legally you want to talk about it. But this is such a common trap, where we assume we have this mountaintop experience with God, where we got to be a part of something big that he was doing, and then immediately I do this all the time with my wife, with Hannah and I, where we will have like an incredible, like just like a great weekend where we feel connected, where we understand each other, where we're not like, we're so in sync, where we know exactly how our words are going to affect the other person. We're careful, we're understanding. and then almost always there's some sort of like massive misstep because we feel like, oh, we've got it figured out. I know exactly what the right thing. I'm going to solve this, or I'm going to be I'm going to be the savior in this situation. And then inevitably we have like the biggest argument we've had in like a month or 2 months or 3 months or however long it would be. And I think this is always a good reminder for ourselves that one, like we're always, even when we're on the mountaintop, Satan never stops coming after us. In fact, sometimes when we are acting in concert and following what God wants us to do, that can a lot of times be when we're our most vulnerable, because it's so easy for Satan to twist the truth that God is working through. God is working through us. God is carrying His will out through us, and twist it into a lie, saying you're doing this, you're doing that, you are like at whatever the particular lie would be. So I think it's just personally a good reminder for myself. One, that God wants to do powerful things through me, and two, just because I reach the mountaintop doesn't mean that Satan is taking a break. Doesn't mean that I'm impervious to all of the faults I had before I got there.
That is tremendous application. One little disclaimer I do want to say, and I think it's clear, but just to make sure, this goes back to the did God want Elijah to lead the people to slaughter these prophets? There are clearly times where God's like, clear it out. I need you to kill them all, So we're not trying, certainly I'm not trying to say God never does that. It's just interesting in times where sometimes David, it's very clear David's supposed to do X. Then there are other times he does stuff and it's like, I don't know if that's of God or not, And I'm mindful of, just multiple times in these battles with the kings, where one time they do it and God's like, absolutely. Then they do virtually the same thing and He's like, yeah, I'm not with that. Mm-hmm. And the whole takeaway for me is not to say here's the protocol that God follows and whether to kill big amounts of people or not. The point there is, and it goes to the point you just made. Am I listening to God? I think there's an assumption if God works powerful through me yesterday, then He's wanting to work even more powerfully through me today. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, that doesn't seem to be any life in the Bible. That idea that, when we think about it, how much do we actually witness Abraham doing? 12 hours worth? 14 hours worth? You have 100 plus years there. And so I'm like, maybe, and this is why when the apostles come back in Luke 10 and they've done all these great things, He's like, yeah, don't focus on the achievements. Focus on the fact your name is written in the book of life. And I think that's the message to me in the safeguard. Just because God used me in some way that was very significant yesterday or 100 years ago doesn't mean that I'm less now because I'm not involved in what I perceive as significant. Yeah. Most faithful people throughout history and in the Bible history, it wasn't like every third day they did something amazing.
Yeah.
And many times they do something amazing at 50 or 80 or 90 and then die, 20 years later, assumedly not having done anything amazing, in that period of time. God is not looking for the achievement. He's looking for the faithfulness.
That's good. And I think that's a good place, because we could honestly keep talking about this for ages, and maybe at some point it'd be really helpful for us to cover a passage where it does seemingly say God says kill all these people, or what. Maybe that'd be really helpful for a non-ambiguous passage to process that and to talk about it. But for right now, I think there's so much here, and we could go on. There's several things we didn't touch on that we could have, but just for time's sake and just for the ability to sit with what we've already talked about, I think this is a good natural stopping place. So next week we'll be moving on into 1 Kings chapter 19, and we're just going to cover verses 1 through 9 of that. So if you want to go ahead and read that so we can all be on the same page as we walk through it and discuss it. As always, if you have any thoughts or questions, or just observations on the text or anything we said, we'd love to hear those. You can email us at amazedandperplexed@gmail.com, or you can send us a message on Facebook or Instagram or our cell phones. Most of you probably have our phone numbers, and if not, I assume my phone number's out there from the number of spam calls I get. You could probably purchase it through a service for a very minimal amount of money, if my call history is any indication. Anyways, we wish you a great week, and may God be with you. Grace, peace, and love.